The highway stretched out endlessly before them, a black ribbon slicing through the desolate desert. Sarah and her best friend Megan were halfway through a cross-country road trip, an adventure they had dreamed about for years. The air in their beat-up sedan was heavy with excitement and fatigue, their playlist looping the same songs for hours. It was nearly midnight, and the gas station they had stopped at earlier was the last sign of civilization they'd seen for miles. And the desert was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the hum of the car's engine and the occasional coyote howling in the distance. The GPS signal had vanished an hour ago, leaving them to rely on a paper map Megan had dug out of the glove compartment. Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel as Megan flipped the map around, squinting at the dim light of the dashboard. "I think we're still on track," Megan said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. Sarah shot her a skeptical look but kept driving. The road seemed to narrow as they pressed on, the darkness growing thicker, almost oppressive. A flicker of movement caught Sarah's eye. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. Both women lurched forward as the car skidded to a halt. "What the hell was that?" Megan asked, her voice high-pitched. Sarah's heart pounded as she scanned the road ahead. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure, tall, thin, and shadowy, disappear into the brush at the edge of the asphalt. She blinked hard, convincing herself it was just her imagination. The desert could play tricks on your eyes, especially after hours of driving. "Probably a coyote," Sarah muttered, trying to sound convincing. She eased her foot off the brake and pressed the gas. The car crept forward, but her nerves remained taut. A few miles later, the headlights illuminated something lying in the middle of the road. It was a bundle, wrapped in what looked like dirty cloth. "Don't stop," Megan said quickly, her voice trembling. "Just go around it." Sarah hesitated. What if it was a person? What if they needed help? Against her better judgment, she slowed the car and rolled down her window. The desert air was cold and carried an unsettling stillness. "Hello?" Sarah called out. Her voice echoed into the void. No response. Megan grabbed her arm. "Sarah, seriously, let's just go." Before Sarah could reply, the bundle moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt of terror through both women. Sarah slammed the car into reverse, backing up quickly. As the headlights swept over the road, they caught a glimpse of something horrifying. The bundle unraveled to reveal a figure, hunched and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long and thin to belong to a human. Its head jerked unnaturally as it rose to its feet, eyes reflecting the car's headlights like an animal's. "Go, go, go!" Megan screamed, clutching the dashboard. Sarah floored the gas pedal, the car roaring as it sped past the figure. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what she might see. Her hands shook violently on the steering wheel, and Megan was hyperventilating beside her. "Did you see its face?" Megan whispered after a few minutes of silence. Sarah didn't answer. She had seen it, and the image was seared into her mind. A gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The road seemed endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Just as they began to think they were in the clear, the car's engine sputtered. The gas gauge, which had shown a quarter tank just moments ago, now read empty. "No, no, no," Sarah muttered, her voice breaking. The car coasted to a stop, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere. Megan fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. Panic set in as they realized how utterly isolated they were. "We can't stay here," Megan said, her voice shaking. "What if that thing comes back?" Sarah grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and opened the door, the cold desert air hitting her like a slap. Megan reluctantly followed, clutching a tire iron. They walked along the road, hoping to find help, a phone signal, anything. The sound of footsteps behind them made them freeze. They turned in unison, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving toward them with a jerky, unnatural gait. It was the same thing they had seen earlier, but now it wasn't alone. More figures stepped out from the brush, their grotesque forms illuminated briefly before disappearing into the dark again. The women ran, their screams swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert. The figures gave chase, their footsteps eerily silent despite their speed. The road stretched endlessly ahead, offering no salvation. Sarah's legs burned, and Megan stumbled, falling hard onto the asphalt. Sarah turned back to help her, but the figures were already upon them. The flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam flickering before going dark. The last sound Sarah heard was Megan's scream, cut off abruptly. Then there was nothing but silence. Days later, a state trooper found their abandoned car on the side of the road. The doors were unlocked, and the keys were still in the ignition. Of Sarah and Megan, there was no trace. Only a single, chilling clue remained. The flashlight, lying in the middle of the road, its lens cracked and smeared with blood. The car's headlights pierced through the rain, illuminating the narrow, winding road ahead. Jake and Lisa, a young couple on their way to a wedding, had taken what they thought would be a scenic shortcut through the mountains. The GPS flickered uncertainly before finally losing signal altogether, leaving them to navigate with nothing but instinct and a gut feeling that they were heading in the right direction. As the rain intensified, the road became more treacherous. The dense forest surrounding them seemed to close in, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Lisa glanced at her phone. No bars, of course. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "This can't be right," she said. "We haven't seen another car for over an hour." Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "It's fine. We'll hit the main highway soon." But as the minutes dragged on, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting deeper into the woods. Then they saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road, drenched and motionless. Jake slowed the car and Lisa's hand shot out to grab his arm. "Don't stop. It's raining, Lisa. They might need help." Jake eased the car to a halt. The figure, a man in his 40s, wearing a soaked flannel shirt, approached the driver's side window. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. "Car broke down," he said flatly, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "Can you give me a ride to the next town?" Lisa's stomach churned. Something about the man felt off. Jake hesitated but finally nodded. "Sure, hop in." The man climbed into the back seat, his wet clothes soaking the upholstery. Lisa kept her eyes forward, gripping her phone tightly even though it was useless without a signal. "What were you doing out here?" Jake asked, trying to make conversation. The man didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and mechanical. "Got lost." Lisa glanced in the rearview mirror and her heart skipped a beat. The man wasn't looking at Jake or at her. He was staring straight ahead, unblinking, his expression blank. The ride stretched on in tense silence, the rain drumming against the car's roof. Then, without warning, the man spoke again. "You shouldn't have taken this road." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" The man didn't respond, but his gaze shifted to Lisa in the mirror. His lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "Pull over," Lisa whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "Let him out." Before Jake could respond, the headlights caught something in the road ahead. A second figure, standing perfectly still, drenched and motionless, just like the man they had picked up. Jake swerved, narrowly missing the figure, and the car skidded to a stop. Lisa turned to confront the man in the back seat, but the seat was empty. Water pooled where he had sat, but he was gone. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his voice shaking. Lisa's breathing was shallow as she scanned the road and the surrounding woods. Where did he go? A soft tapping on the passenger side window made her scream. Another figure, identical to the man they had picked up, was standing outside the car, staring at her with that same unsettling smile. Jake hit the gas, the tires spinning briefly before the car lurched forward. They sped down the road, the headlights catching more figures along the way. They stood in clusters now, their faces blank and their eyes unblinking, all watching as the car passed. "We need to turn around," Lisa cried. Jake shook his head, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "No way, we're getting out of here." But the figures didn't stop. They began to appear in the middle of the road, forcing Jake to swerve again and again. The car veered off the asphalt and onto a dirt path, bouncing violently as they sped deeper into the forest. Then the car stalled. The engine sputtered once, twice, and died. No, 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 Jake muttered, frantically turning the key. The engine wouldn't restart. The rain had stopped and the sudden silence was deafening. Lisa reached for her door handle, but Jake grabbed her arm. "Don't get out!" A faint sound reached their ears. A low, rhythmic drumming like footsteps on wet ground. It was coming closer. Jake locked the doors and flicked on the interior light. The figures were emerging from the trees now, dozens of them. They surrounded the car, their expressions eerily identical. Pale skin, hollow eyes, faint smiles. Lisa screamed as the windows began to fog from the outside, as if they were all breathing in unison. The sound of fingernails scratching the glass filled the car. Jake yelled, slamming his fists on the steering wheel, but there was nowhere to go. The figures pressed their faces against the windows, their smiles widening into something grotesque, inhuman. Then the car's lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The last thing Lisa heard was the sound of the driver's side door unlocking, followed by the soft click of it opening. The endless stretch of the open highway was supposed to be freeing, but for Brian, it had become a test of endurance. He had been driving for hours, pushing through fatigue, determined to make it to his sister's house by morning. The radio crackled with static, and his phone battery had died hours ago. There wasn't another car in sight, just the oppressive darkness pressing in from the vast, empty plains. The gas gauge dipped toward empty, and Brian cursed under his breath. Just as the needle hit the red, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. A gas station. Relief washed over him as he pulled into the dimly lit lot. The building looked ancient, its neon open sign flickering ominously. A single pump stood outside, and there were no other cars around. Brian stepped out into the chilly night, the air thick with an eerie stillness. He glanced toward the station's windows, but they were covered with grime, making it impossible to see inside. He picked up the nozzle and started pumping. The gas flowed slowly, the tick of the meter loud in the silence. As he waited, Brian's eyes wandered to the dark expanse beyond the station. The faint sound of footsteps made him turn sharply, but there was nothing there, just the empty lot and the open road. The pump clicked, signaling it was done. He returned the nozzle, but when he tried to swipe his card, the machine beeped an error. Groaning, he grabbed his wallet and headed inside. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped in. The air inside was stale, reeking of mildew. Rows of dusty shelves held expired snacks, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Behind the counter sat a man who looked as ancient as the building. His eyes were sunken, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. "Just the gas," Brian said, sliding a 20 across the counter. The man didn't respond. He simply stared at Brian, unblinking. Hello?" Brian prompted. The man's lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. "You shouldn't be here." Brian's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised a bony hand and pointed toward the door. "Leave. Now." Unnerved, Brian grabbed his change and hurried back to the car. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced back at the station. The man was still standing at the counter, watching him through the dirty glass. Shaking off the encounter, Brian started the engine and pulled onto the highway. He drove in tense silence, the events replaying in his mind. He didn't notice the figure in his rearview mirror until it was too late. A man was standing in the middle of the road. Brian swerved, barely missing him. His heart pounded as he skidded to a stop. He looked back, but the road was empty. No sign of the man. "Get a grip," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He started driving again, but the tension in his chest wouldn't ease. The road seemed darker now, the night heavier. Minutes later, his headlights illuminated something ahead. A car, overturned on the side of the road. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, casting the scene in an unsettling red glow. Brian slowed down, his instincts screaming at him to keep going. But what if someone was hurt? Against his better judgment, he pulled over and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. The wrecked car was empty, its windows shattered. Blood smeared the driver's seat, but there was no one around. Brian's pulse quickened as he scanned the area with his flashlight. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed into the night. A rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. He aimed the light toward it, the beam trembling in his hand. A figure emerged, a woman, barefoot and wearing a torn dress. Her hair hung in matted clumps over her face. "Are you okay?" Brian asked, taking a cautious step forward. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "I can call for help," Brian said, though he had no working phone. He took another step, and the woman's head snapped up to look at him. Her eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to pull him in. Brian stumbled back, his flashlight dropping to the ground. The woman let out a guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a scream, and lunged toward him. He turned and ran, his breath ragged as he sprinted back to the car. He fumbled with the keys, finally throwing himself inside and locking the doors. As he started the engine, the headlights illuminated the road ahead, and the figures standing in it. Dozens of them, all pale and motionless, their black eyes glinting in the light. Brian slammed the car into reverse, his tires screeching as he turned sharply and sped away. But the figures were everywhere now, appearing along the sides of the road, stepping out from the shadows. Their faces were all the same, blank and expressionless except for those haunting black eyes. The car's engines sputtered, and Brian screamed in frustration. He pounded the steering wheel as the car rolled to a stop. The figures closed in, their footsteps eerily silent despite the gravel underfoot. Brian locked the doors and turned off the headlights, plunging the car into darkness. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't notice him. But then came the sound of fingernails scratching the windows, a slow, deliberate sound that sent shivers down his spine. The last thing Brian saw was a face pressed against the driver's side window, its mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin before the glass shattered. The winding back road stretched endlessly, each turn looking the same as the last. Hannah and her two friends, Emma and Chris, were on their way to a music festival, but a series of wrong turns had left them hopelessly lost. Their GPS was dead, their phones had no signal, and the trees lining the road grew denser with each mile. Chris, at the wheel, sighed. "We should have stayed on the main highway." "It's fine," Emma said from the back seat. "We'll find a gas station or something soon." Hannah stared out the window, the unease in her stomach growing with every passing moment. The woods outside were unnaturally still, as though the entire forest were holding its breath. After another 20 minutes, a sign appeared, rusted and barely legible. "Black Hollow Rest Stop, 1 mile ahead." "Finally," Chris said, relief evident in his voice. The rest stop turned out to be a small, dilapidated diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Open." A single car sat in the parking lot, an old, rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. "I'm not going in there," Hannah said, her voice trembling. "We need directions," Chris said, cutting the engine. "And food. I'm starving." Reluctantly, the trio stepped out of the car. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Hannah's throat tighten. The windows of the diner were caked with grime, and the fluorescent lights inside buzzed faintly. Chris pushed open the door, the bell above jingling weakly. Inside, the diner was eerily quiet. A single waitress stood behind the counter, her back turned to them as she wiped at a spot that didn't seem to exist. The air smelled of burnt grease and something else, something sour and sickly sweet. "Hi," Chris said. "Do you know how we can get back to the main highway?" The waitress turned slowly, too slowly, and fixed them with a wide smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sure thing. Have a seat first. I'll get you something to eat." Emma shrugged and slid into a booth, but Hannah hesitated. "We just need directions. We're kind of in a hurry." The waitress's smile faltered, her expression growing colder. "Sit down." Chris raised an eyebrow at Hannah, then joined Emma in the booth. Reluctantly, Hannah followed, her unease growing stronger. As they sat, they noticed the only other patron in the diner, a man in a tattered coat sitting in the corner. His head was bowed, and he was muttering something under his breath, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "What's his deal?" Emma whispered. The waitress reappeared, slamming down 3 glasses of water. The liquid was cloudy, and Hannah could swear she saw something writhing at the bottom. "Menus are on the table," the waitress said, her tone flat. "We're not staying long," Chris said. "Can you just—" The man in the corner let out a sharp, guttural laugh. It was a sudden, unnatural sound that made all 3 of them jump. He lifted his head, revealing wide, bloodshot eyes and a grin that stretched far too wide. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice raspy and broken. "Okay, we're leaving," Hannah said, standing abruptly, but the waitress stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You haven't eaten yet," she said, her voice taking on an edge. "We're not hungry," Chris said, standing as well. The waitress's smile returned, but it was wrong now, too wide, too toothy. "Oh, you'll eat. Everyone eats at Black Hollow." The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy. The man in the corner let out another laugh, this one louder, more frenzied. His tapping turned to pounding, the sound echoing in the small diner. "We need to go," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Hannah pushed past the waitress, who didn't try to stop her this time. The trio bolted for the door, but when they stepped outside, the world had changed. The parking lot was gone, replaced by an endless field of dead grass. The diner was now the only structure in sight, its flickering neon sign casting an unnatural red glow over the landscape. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, spinning around. The waitress stood in the doorway, her smile gone. "You're not leaving?" she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Behind her, the man from the corner stepped out, followed by others, figures emerging from the shadows inside the diner. Their faces were blank, their movements jerky, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Chris grabbed Hannah's hand, and the three of them ran. The field stretched endlessly, the dead grass crunching beneath their feet. The figures from the diner followed, their movements impossibly fast despite their awkward gait. Hannah's lungs burned as she ran, but the figures were gaining. She glanced back and froze. The waitress was leading them now, her face distorted, her jaw unhinged and stretching far too wide. Her eyes glowed with a pale, unnatural light. "This way," Chris shouted, pulling her toward a dark shape in the distance. A car. Their car. Somehow it was parked in the middle of the field. They reached the car and Chris fumbled with the keys, finally throwing the door open. They all piled in, slamming the doors just as the figures reached them. Chris started the engine, and the headlights illuminated the horde. Their faces were pressed against the windows, mouths opening and closing soundlessly. The car roared to life, and Chris floored it. The figures didn't chase them this time. Instead, they stood motionless, their blank faces watching as the car sped away. When they finally found the main highway, no one spoke. The diner, and whatever hellish place surrounded it, was nowhere to be seen. But Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. In the rearview mirror, just for a moment, she thought she saw the flicker of a neon sign. Black Hollow, open. The road cut through the wilderness like a black scar, the tall pines on either side swallowing the moonlight. Jacob was driving back from a weekend fishing trip, his truck the only vehicle for miles. The radio was out of range, his phone had no signal, and the endless hum of the tires on asphalt was his only company. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:47 a.m. The trip home always felt longer, especially on these desolate back roads. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught something up ahead. A car pulled to the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly. Jacob slowed, his truck crawling to a stop beside the vehicle. It was an old sedan, battered and rusted. The driver's door was open, but there was no one inside. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. "Hello?" he called out, leaning out of the window. The forest swallowed his voice. No answer. He hesitated. Everything about the scene screamed to keep driving, but what if someone needed help? He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. The car's interior was empty, save for a scattering of papers and an old coffee cup in the cup holder. The faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air. Jacob's flashlight beam swept over the area, catching movement in the underbrush nearby. "Hey!" he called again, his voice louder now. "You okay?" A soft rustling came from the trees, followed by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. It sounded like a voice, but the words were garbled, distorted. Jacob's heart began to race. "If you need help, say something." The whisper grew louder, shifting in tone. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, overlapping in a cacophony of nonsensical murmurs. His flashlight flickered, the beam weakening, and the whispers stopped. Then he saw her. A woman stepped out from the trees, her movements jerky and unnatural like a puppet on strings. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, her long, dark hair obscuring her face. She wore a pale dress that was torn and dirty, the hem soaked with something dark. "Are you okay?" Jacob asked, taking a cautious step back. She didn't respond. She stood motionless, her head twitching slightly as if she were trying to listen for something. The forest was deathly silent now, the air thick with a sense of wrongness. "Lady, if you're hurt, I can." The woman's head snapped up, and Jacob's words died in his throat. Her face was pale, her eyes impossibly wide, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Without warning, she sprinted toward him, her limbs moving unnaturally fast. Jacob stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. He scrambled into his truck, slamming the door just as her hand slapped against the window. Her fingers were long, too long, and her nails scratched against the glass with an ear-piercing screech. Her face pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. He floored the gas, the truck lurching forward. The woman clung to the side, her nails scraping deep gouges into the metal before she finally let go, disappearing into the darkness. Jacob didn't stop. His hands trembled on the wheel as he sped down the road, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees leaning toward the road like they were trying to reach him. Then, the truck's headlights illuminated something up ahead. Another car pulled to the side of the road, the same battered sedan, its hazard lights blinking weakly. "No," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's not possible." He slowed, his truck coming to a reluctant stop. The driver's door of the sedan was open again, just as before, but this time there was someone inside. A man, slumped over the steering wheel. Jacob honked the horn, but the man didn't move. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, he stepped out of the truck and approached the car. "Hey, buddy," Jacob called, his voice shaking. "You okay?" The man didn't respond. Jacob reached for the door handle, but the moment his fingers touched the cold metal, the man's head snapped up. His face was twisted into the same expression of wide-eyed terror, his mouth hanging open in a soundless scream. Behind Jacob, the whispers returned. He spun around, his flashlight beam darting wildly. The woman was back, standing in the middle of the road, her head twitching. But she wasn't alone. Dozens of figures emerged from the forest, their movements stiff and unnatural. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths opened in unison, emitting a low, guttural moan that made Jacob's blood run cold. He bolted for his truck, the figures closing in fast. He barely made it inside, slamming the door and locking it. They surrounded the vehicle, their hands slapping against the windows, their faces pressing against the glass. The engine roared to life, and Jacob floored it, the truck barreling through the crowd. The figures didn't flinch as the vehicle plowed into them. They simply dissolved into shadows, only to reappear further down the road. The sedan was gone now, replaced by a figure standing alone in the road. It was the woman again, her head tilted, her empty eyes staring directly at him. Jacob swerved to avoid her, but she didn't move. As the truck sped past, she turned to watch him, her head twisting unnaturally until it was facing backward. The road stretched on endlessly, the same trees, the same shadows, the same oppressive darkness. No matter how far Jacob drove, he couldn't escape. The whispers followed him, growing louder, closer. And then the headlights caught it, the battered sedan, its hazard lights blinking weakly. The late-night highway was eerily empty, stretching out in front of Claire like a black ribbon under the pale glow of her headlights. She was driving home from a weekend visit to her parents. The only sound, the hum of her tires and the faint crackle of the radio, struggling to find a station. The clock on her dashboard read 1:37 a.m. The night had an unsettling stillness, and every shadow along the roadside seemed to shift in her peripheral vision. She shook off the creeping unease. "It's just your imagination," she muttered to herself. As Claire rounded a bend, she spotted something up ahead, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, their arm outstretched in a hitchhiker's gesture. She slowed instinctively, her heart pounding. It was a young woman, barefoot and wearing a tattered white dress, her hair a tangled mess that obscured part of her face. Her skin was pale, almost luminous in the headlights. Claire rolled down her window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't answer. She simply stared at Claire with wide, hollow eyes, her mouth slightly open as if she were about to speak, but couldn't find the words. Something about her felt off, but Claire couldn't just drive away. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the passenger door. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere safe." The woman climbed in silently, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't speak as she settled into the seat, folding her hands in her lap. The smell of damp earth filled the car, and Claire tried not to wrinkle her nose. "Where are you headed?" Claire asked, her voice tight. The woman turned her head slowly, fixing Claire with that same vacant stare. "Just drive," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran down Claire's spine, but she obeyed, pulling back onto the highway. The woman sat perfectly still, her hands unmoving, her face expressionless. Claire's grip on the wheel tightened, and she couldn't help glancing at her passenger out of the corner of her eye. "Were you in an accident or something?" Claire asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned her head to look out the window, her reflection in the glass distorted and strange. Claire's unease deepened. "Look, if you're in trouble, I can call someone." "No one can help me," the woman interrupted, her tone flat. "They tried. They all tried." Claire's stomach twisted. "What do you mean? Who tried?" The woman didn't answer. She raised her hand and pointed ahead. "Turn here." Claire hadn't seen the turnoff until the woman pointed it out. It was a narrow dirt road that cut into the forest, almost invisible in the darkness. "Are you sure? This doesn't look like—" "Turn here," the woman repeated, her voice cold and firm. Against every instinct screaming at her to keep driving, Claire turned onto the dirt road. The trees closed in around her, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The car's headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. Claire's breath quickened. "Where exactly are we going?" The woman didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her hands now gripping the edges of her seat. The radio crackled, and a faint, distorted voice broke through the static. It was whispering something, a garbled mix of words that Claire couldn't make out. She reached to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the car. Claire's heart pounded as she slammed her hand against the radio, but the noise didn't stop. "Stop the car," the woman said suddenly. "What?" Claire asked, her voice shaking. "Stop the car," the woman repeated, more forcefully this time. Claire hit the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the dirt road. The whispering from the radio ceased abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The woman turned to face Claire, her eyes dark and unblinking. "You shouldn't have picked me up." Claire's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "They always pick me up," the woman said, her voice hollow. "And they always regret it." Before Claire could respond, the woman's face began to change. Her skin grew pale and translucent, her eyes sinking into dark hollows. Her mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Claire screamed, fumbling for the door handle, but it wouldn't open. The woman leaned closer, her breath icy against Claire's cheek. "You should have kept driving." The headlights flickered, and the shadows outside the car seemed to come alive. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They surrounded the car, their faces obscured by shadows, their hands pressing against the windows. Claire slammed her foot on the gas, but the car didn't move. The engine revved uselessly as the figures closed in. The woman's distorted face was inches from Claire's now, her eyes filled with something ancient and malevolent. "You can't escape." The last thing Claire saw before the headlights went out was the woman's face twisting into an unnatural, grotesque smile. When Claire's car was found 2 days later, it was abandoned in the middle of the dirt road. The engine was still running, the driver's door wide open. There was no sign of Claire. But those who ventured into the forest at night claimed to hear her screams, mingling with the faint whispers of the radio that no one could ever turn off. The night stretched out like an endless void as Dan and Liz drove along a forgotten stretch of highway. They were hours from civilization, the closest thing to a landmark being the faint glow of a gas station sign far in the distance. The road trip had been Dan's idea, a chance to disconnect, he'd said, but now even he seemed uneasy in the oppressive darkness. "Are we sure this is the right way?" Liz asked, her voice tight. She clutched her phone, though it had lost signal hours ago. Dan glanced at the GPS, its screen frozen on a blurry map. "It's supposed to be a shortcut. Just hang tight. We'll hit that gas station soon." The car rumbled on, its headlights carving through the pitch-black night. But as they approached the gas station, something felt off. The sign flickered erratically, casting strange, uneven shadows over the station's dilapidated facade. Dan pulled into the lot, the car's tires crunching on gravel. The station looked abandoned. One of the pumps was tipped over, its hose coiled like a dead snake. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. "Let's just keep going," Liz said, her voice trembling. "We're almost out of gas," Dan replied, stepping out of the car. "I'll check if anyone's inside. Maybe they've got a generator or something." Liz stayed in the car, locking the doors as Dan walked toward the building. The wind howled, carrying with it a faint metallic smell that made her stomach churn. Dan pushed the door open, the creak echoing into the darkness. "Hello?" he called out. His voice seemed to vanish into the void, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The interior was a mess. Shelves were overturned, their contents scattered across the floor. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through a crack in the ceiling. A faint scratching noise came from somewhere deeper inside. "Anyone here?" Dan asked again, his voice faltering. He took a step forward, his shoe crunching on shattered glass. In the car, Liz's anxiety grew. She kept her eyes on the gas station, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. She jumped when she saw movement in the rearview mirror, a shadow darting behind the car. "Dan!" she yelled, but her voice felt small against the night. Dan froze at the sound of her voice, then turned back toward the door. Before he could move, the scratching noise intensified, growing louder and more erratic. He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping the room, but there was nothing there. "Liz, we're leaving," he shouted, bolting for the door. He barely made it outside when he saw Liz pounding on the car window. "Behind you," she screamed. Dan whipped around just as a figure lunged out of the shadows. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its face a featureless void, except for a gaping, tooth-filled mouth. It moved with an unnatural, jerky speed, and its guttural growl sent Dan stumbling backward. "Get in the car!" Liz screamed, unlocking the doors. Dan dove in, slamming the door shut as the creature slammed against the side of the car. Its hands clawed at the window, leaving deep, jagged scratches. Dan floored the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The creature gave chase, its elongated limbs propelling it with terrifying speed. Liz screamed as it clawed at the rear of the car, leaving gouges in the metal. "Faster!" she yelled. "I'm going as fast as I can!" Dan shouted back, his knuckles white on the wheel. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the gas station disappearing into the darkness behind them. But the creature didn't relent. It ran alongside the car now, its toothy grin wide and menacing. It slammed its fist against the passenger window, as flat the glass spiderwebbing under the impact. Dan swerved, trying to shake it off, but the creature leapt onto the roof, its claws tearing through the metal. The sound was deafening, like nails on a chalkboard. "Liz, grab the flashlight," Dan yelled. Liz fumbled for the flashlight on the floor, her hands trembling. She rolled down her window slightly and shined the beam onto the roof. The creature hissed, its skin blistering under the light. It screeched and leapt off, disappearing into the night. Dan didn't slow down. He kept driving, his heart pounding, until the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. They didn't stop until they reached a small diner at the edge of a tiny town. The waitress stared at them as they stumbled inside, their clothes torn and faces pale. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring them coffee. Dan nodded, his hands still shaking. "You could say that." The waitress leaned in, her voice low. "You didn't take the old highway, did you?" Dan and Liz exchanged a look. "Why?" Liz asked, her voice barely a whisper. The waitress's expression darkened. "People don't come back from there. Not whole, anyway." Dan's stomach dropped, and he glanced out the window. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, he swore he saw a shadow move. The open road stretched endlessly before Jake and Tyler as their beat-up car barreled through the desolate desert highway. The brothers were on their way to a music festival, their spirits high despite the isolation of the barren landscape around them. The sun had long set, leaving only the pale glow of moonlight to illuminate the empty world beyond the reach of their headlights. "Did you see the last sign?" Tyler asked, fiddling with the map on his phone. "I think the next gas station's still 50 miles out." Jake nodded, his grip on the wheel firm. "We've got enough to make it. Barely." The road was lifeless, lined with cracked asphalt and nothing but miles of shrubs and sand. Tyler leaned his head against the window, the rhythmic hum of the car's engine lulling him into a light doze. Jake kept his focus forward, though his eyes occasionally darted to the gas gauge, which hovered dangerously close to empty. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life, spewing static. Jake frowned, reaching to turn it off, but the static morphed into faint, distorted voices. Words were garbled and indistinguishable, like fragments of a conversation not meant to be heard. "Did you touch something?" Jake asked, glancing at Tyler, who stirred awake. "No," Tyler muttered groggily. "Why?" Jake gestured to the radio. Tyler leaned forward, frowning as the static gave way to a chilling voice. "You're not alone out here." Both brothers froze. Jake hit the power button, but the radio refused to turn off. The voice continued, this time a whisper that sent shivers crawling down their spines. "Keep driving. Don't look back." "What the hell is this?" Tyler said, his voice rising with panic. "Probably some sick prank," Jake muttered, but his hands were trembling. He slammed the power button again, and this time the radio fell silent. The tension in the car was palpable as the highway stretched endlessly ahead, but then Tyler spotted something in the rearview mirror. "Jake, there's someone behind us." Jake glanced at the mirror. Far in the distance, a pair of faint headlights appeared, flickering like a dying flame. "Finally, someone else on this road," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But as the car approached, something felt wrong. The lights grew brighter, unnaturally so, and Jake realized with a jolt that the vehicle wasn't slowing down. It was barreling toward them at an alarming speed. "Jake, floor it!" Tyler shouted. Jake slammed the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The pursuing vehicle kept pace, its headlights burning with an eerie intensity. Tyler twisted in his seat to get a better look, but immediately regretted it. The car chasing them wasn't normal. Its outline shimmered and its windows were pitch black, as if swallowing any light that touched them. "It's not a car," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's not a car." The thing behind them roared, its engine a guttural, otherworldly growl that made the brothers' car shudder. It was inches from their bumper now, its headlights flooding their car with blinding white light. "Jake, do something," Tyler yelled. "I'm trying." Jake shouted back, swerving onto a side road that appeared suddenly to their left. The other vehicle didn't follow. It stopped abruptly at the junction, its lights dimming. Jake and Tyler gasped for breath as they continued down the side road, their hearts pounding like drums. But their relief was short-lived. The side road twisted through a narrow canyon, and the walls seemed to close in as the darkness grew deeper. The car's headlights barely pierced the gloom, and the silence was deafening. Then they saw it. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, and draped in tattered black fabric that fluttered despite the still air. Its head tilted unnaturally as it stared at them, though it had no eyes to see. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet from the figure. For a moment, everything was still. Then the figure began to move, its long, spindly limbs bending and twisting as it advanced toward them. "Reverse! Reverse!" Tyler screamed. Jake threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. The figure kept coming, its movements jerky and unnatural. The brothers were trapped. "Get out!" Jake shouted, fumbling with his door handle. But when they stepped out of the car, the air around them felt wrong, thick and heavy, as if the night itself were alive and watching. The figure was gone. "Where?" Tyler began, but his words were cut off by a deafening roar. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, rattling their bones. Jake turned to see their car. Its headlights flickered, and for a split second he saw something inside. It wasn't human. It grinned at him with too many teeth, its hollow eyes locking onto his. The headlights died, plunging them into darkness. Tyler grabbed Jake's arm, and they ran blindly down the road, their breath ragged, their footsteps echoing in the canyon. The roar followed them, growing louder, closer. They didn't dare look back. When they finally stumbled out of the canyon hours later, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. They collapsed on the roadside, gasping for air. A truck driver found them later that morning, their faces pale and haunted. The brothers tried to explain, but their story was met with skeptical glances and pitying smiles. Their car was never found. But sometimes, travelers on that stretch of highway report seeing headlights in the distance, lights that seem to chase them, no matter how fast they drive. And if you stop, they say, you'll hear a voice whisper from the radio, "Keep driving. Don't look back." The night was cool, with a full moon hanging low over the deserted road. Claire and her boyfriend, Mike, were on their way back from a weekend at her parents' cabin. The GPS had gone offline hours ago, leaving them to navigate by memory. The winding back roads stretched endlessly, lined by tall trees that seemed to lean inward, their skeletal branches creating eerie shadows. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Claire asked, her voice laced with unease. "Positive," Mike replied, though his tone lacked confidence. "We'll hit the main highway soon." The car's engine hummed steadily, a comforting sound against the oppressive silence of the forest. But then, in the distance, a figure appeared, standing in the middle of the road. "Do you see that?" Claire whispered, her hand clutching Mike's arm. Mike slowed the car, squinting. The figure was dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, faded trousers, suspenders, and a wide-brimmed hat. His head was bowed, obscuring his face. Maybe he needs help, Mike suggested, but his foot hesitated on the brake. Don't stop, Claire said quickly, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. The figure didn't move as the car crept closer, but as they passed, his head lifted. Claire gasped. His face was unnaturally pale, and his eyes glinted like glass, reflecting the moonlight. He turned his head slowly, watching them as they drove by. Did you see his eyes? Claire asked, her voice trembling. Mike nodded, gripping the wheel tightly. It's fine. He's probably just some weirdo. But as the car rounded a bend, the headlights illuminated another figure standing in the road. This one was a woman, her dress tattered and stained. She had the same glassy eyes and a hollow, unblinking stare. What the hell? Mike muttered, slamming on the brakes. Claire screamed as she looked in the rearview mirror. Like the man they'd passed earlier was now walking toward the car, his movements jerky and unnatural. Go, she yelled, panic flooding her voice. Mike hit the gas, swerving around the woman. The car sped down the road, but the figures didn't fade into the distance. They were still visible, somehow keeping pace, their forms flickering in and out of view like a bad signal on an old TV. This isn't happening, Mike muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Then, the car's engine sputtered. The headlights flickered. Claire's heart sank as the vehicle slowed to a stop. No, 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 Mike shouted, twisting the key in the ignition, but the car refused to start. The forest fell silent. Not a single insect chirped, not a leaf rustled. It was an oppressive, suffocating silence. Claire and Mike sat frozen, their breaths shallow as they scanned the darkness. The figures emerged from the shadows surrounding the car. There were more now, a dozen, maybe more, each with the same lifeless eyes and slow, deliberate movements. They closed in, their faces pressed against the windows, their hands leaving smudges on the glass as they clawed at it. Lock the doors, Claire screamed, though she already knew it wouldn't matter. The radio crackled to life, static filling the car. Then a voice emerged, low and distorted. You shouldn't have come here. Mike and Claire stared at each other, terror etched on their faces. The figures began to rock the car, their pale faces emotionless but relentless. What do they want? Claire whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. The voice on the radio answered as if it had heard her question. You. With a deafening crash, the rear windshield shattered. Pale hands reached through, their jagged nails scraping against the seats. Mike grabbed a tire iron from under his seat and swung wildly, hitting one of the figures, but it didn't react. It didn't bleed. It didn't even flinch. Run! He yelled, grabbing Claire's hand and yanking her out of the car. They bolted into the woods, their feet crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The figures followed, their glassy eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Claire's lungs burned as she ran, the sound of their pursuers growing louder. Mike pulled her behind a large tree, clamping a hand over her mouth to muffle her ragged breaths. The figures passed by, their movements eerily synchronized. For a moment, it seemed they had lost them. Then, a voice whispered from the shadows, We see you. Claire turned her head and screamed. One of the figures was inches away, its face inches from hers. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. Mike swung the tire iron again, but this time it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The figure lunged, its cold, skeletal hands gripping Mike's arm. He screamed as his skin turned gray and withered under its touch. Run, Claire, he gasped, his voice weak. She stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to move, but her legs felt like lead. The last thing she saw was Mike collapsing to the ground, the life draining from his body as the figures surrounded him. Claire turned and ran blindly through the forest, tears blurring her vision. She didn't stop until she stumbled onto a narrow dirt road. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and she waved her arms frantically. The truck driver who stopped found her trembling and incoherent. She tried to explain what had happened, but her words came out as jumbled sobs. He drove her to the nearest town where she told her story to the police. The car was never found. Neither was Mike. But Claire swears she still hears the voice from the radio in her dreams, whispering, You shouldn't have come here. The summer of 1997 was supposed to be unforgettable for college friends, Hannah, Rachel, and Jake. They had planned a cross-country road trip, mapping out scenic routes and quirky roadside attractions, the kind of adventure they'd laugh about for years to come. But by the end of it, none of them would speak of it again. It all started on a remote highway in Arizona. The sun had set hours ago, and the trio had been driving for what felt like forever. They had planned to stop in a small town, but the GPS kept glitching, and they missed the exit. With no cell service and gas running low, they decided to keep moving, hoping to stumble upon a station. That's when they saw it, a flickering neon sign that read, "Last Chance Gas, open 24 hours." The station sat in near darkness, save for the weak glow of the sign. The building looked ancient, its wooden panels warped and cracked. A single pump stood in front, and an old pickup truck was parked beside it. As they pulled up, they noticed the truck's windows were fogged, though the night was cool. Jake hopped out to fill the tank while Hannah and Rachel went inside to pay. The moment they stepped into the station, the air felt wrong. Too still, too heavy. The shelves were stocked with dusty, expired goods, and an unsettling stench lingered. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his eyes pale and unblinking. He didn't say a word as they approached, only nodding toward a cash register that seemed older than the building itself. "Just 20 on pump 1, Rachel said, her voice uneasy. The man's lips twisted into a grin, revealing teeth yellowed and sharp. "You'll want to be careful out there," he rasped. His voice sounded like the creak of an old door. Hannah forced a smile and thanked him, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that his grin never reached his eyes. They left the station quickly, only to find Jake staring at the pickup truck. "There's someone in there," he said, his voice low. Hannah leaned closer, peering through the fogged window. Inside, the silhouette of a figure sat unnaturally still. Jake tapped on the glass, but there was no reaction. "Let's just go," Rachel urged, her voice trembling. As they got back in their car, the truck's headlights suddenly flared on. The engine roared to life, startling them. Jake floored the gas pedal, speeding off into the night, but the truck followed. At first, they thought it was a coincidence, but as the miles stretched on, it became clear the truck was chasing them. Every time they turned onto a new road, the truck was there, its high beams blinding and unrelenting. It would lag behind only to catch up with terrifying speed. Panic set in as their gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty. "There's a turnoff up ahead," Hannah shouted, pointing to a narrow dirt road. Jake swerved onto it, and the car jolted violently on the uneven terrain. The truck didn't follow. They drove for what felt like hours until the road dead-ended at an abandoned motel. Too exhausted to keep driving, they decided to spend the night there. The building was decrepit, its windows boarded up, but they had no other choice. Inside, the air was thick with mildew, and the furniture was covered in dusty sheets. They found a single room with 3 beds and locked the door. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless. Sometime in the night, Hannah woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and growing louder. She shook Jake awake, and they both listened, frozen. The doorknob rattled. Rachel bolted upright, her eyes wide with fear. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice breaking. The rattling stopped, but a low whisper seeped through the door. "You shouldn't have stopped." The trio scrambled to block the door with furniture, their hearts pounding. The whispers continued, unintelligible and chilling. Then, the sound of heavy boots moved down the hall, fading into silence. When morning came, the motel was eerily quiet. They packed their things and fled, not daring to look back. Weeks later, Rachel tried to find the gas station on a map, but it wasn't there. Neither was the motel. Locals claimed the highway had been abandoned for decades, deemed too dangerous after a string of unexplained disappearances. To this day, none of them know who or what was in the truck. All they know is that they survived, though they were never quite the same. They never spoke of the trip again, but every now and then, Hannah swears she sees a pair of headlights in her rearview mirror, following her,